The emergency signal came screaming to the darkness of space from Sector 447. Most civilizations in the galaxy had written off this region as a dead zone years ago. Nothing good ever came from that corner of space. But now, the Veltari mining colony on Outpost Kepler 7 was sending out a desperate cry for help. Admiral Rebecca Hayes sat in her command chair aboard the TSS Indomitable, watching the distress signal play over and over again on her screen. The voices were panicked, breaking up with static. Unknown vessels, overwhelming force, they're harvesting. Please, anyone? Then nothing. Complete silence. The colony had gone dark. Rebecca had been in the military for 23 years. She had seen plenty of distress calls in her time. Some were false alarms. Some came too late. But this one made her blood run cold. The word harvesting meant only one thing in this sector. The Marauders had found another target. Back at Galactic Council headquarters, the politicians had already made their decision. Rebecca had listened to the transmission with growing anger. The council representative spoke in calm, measured tones about acceptable losses and strategic priorities. They pointed out that the Marauder swarms were too dangerous, too unpredictable. 3 different alien military forces had already tried to fight them in that sector. All 3 had been wiped out completely. The council's final word was simple: put up a quarantine zone around Sector 447 and forget about everyone inside. Write them off as casualties of war. But one voice disagreed. The Veltari ambassador, a dignified alien named Kelvin who had worked with humans for decades, made a direct appeal. He didn't go through official channels. He didn't file the proper paperwork. Instead, he sent a message on every human military frequency he could access. His message was short and direct. He reminded humanity of the treaty they had signed, the promises they had made. More than that, he reminded them of something the rest of the galaxy seemed to have forgotten. Humans kept their promises. Humans didn't leave their friends behind to die. Rebecca gathered her senior officers in the war room 2 hours after receiving Kelvin's message. The room was cramped and functional, nothing like the grand strategy chambers the other species used. Maps and tactical displays covered every wall. 15 ship captains appeared on video screens around the table, their faces grim and focused. This was humanity's 3rd expeditionary fleet. 2 massive dreadnoughts that could crack planets. 6 cruisers built for speed and firepower, for destroyers designed to hunt and kill. 3 support vessels that everyone assumed were just supply ships. 15 ships total. The other species would have laughed at such a small force. The previous alien battle groups that had tried to save Sector 447 had brought 50 ships, 100 ships, even 200 ships in one case. All had failed. All had been destroyed. What could 15 human ships possibly do against odds like that? Commander Michael Patterson stood at the tactical display, his fingers dancing across the holographic controls. He had been Rebecca's right hand for 8 years. He was methodical, brilliant, and absolutely ruthless when the situation called for it. The display showed their enemy in brutal detail. Between 200 and 300 Marauder vessels were swarming around the Veltari colony like flies on rotting meat. These weren't normal ships. The Marauders built their vessels from scavenged metal and organic tissue, creating nightmare machines that were part spaceship and part living creature. They would descend on a world, strip it of every resource, and move on to the next target. Planets, stations, entire civilizations. Nothing was safe when the Marauders decided to feed. How long do the colonists have? Rebecca asked quietly. Michael didn't hesitate. Based on previous Marauder feeding patterns, maybe 72 hours. After that, there won't be anyone left to save. The room fell silent. Every captain knew what those words meant. They had all seen the aftermath of Marauder attacks, the emptied cities, the harvested populations, the complete and total destruction of everything that made a place worth living in. Rebecca studied the tactical map for a long moment. Every other species that had tried to fight the Marauders had used the same basic strategy. They would jump into the system with their largest ships leading the way. They would announce their presence and demand the Marauders surrender. They would form up in traditional battle formations and try to win through sheer firepower. It was the way warfare had been conducted in the galaxy for thousands of years. Honor, protocol, rules of engagement, and it had gotten thousands of soldiers killed. "Here's what we're going to do," Rebecca said, her voice cutting through the tension. "We're going to forget everything the Galactic Council thinks they know about warfare. We're not going to announce ourselves. We're not going to give them a chance to surrender. We're not going to fight fair." She pulled up a file on her command tablet and transmitted it to every captain. The file name was simple: Implementation Protocol Harbinger. It was a combat strategy developed by human military theorists over centuries of brutal warfare. Wars fought on Earth when humanity was still learning how to kill each other efficiently. Wars fought in the colonies when humans encountered their first hostile aliens. Hard lessons written in blood and survival. "The Marauders think they're the apex predators in this galaxy," Rebecca continued. "They've been feeding on civilized species for so long that they've forgotten what real predators look like. They're about to get a reminder. We're not going to Sector 447 as rescuers. We're going as hunters. And we're going to teach these things why you don't mess with humanity's allies." The captains nodded slowly, understanding spreading across their faces. This wasn't going to be a glorious battle. This was going to be an execution, cold, calculated, and absolutely merciless. Michael pulled up the final tactical assessment. "Admiral, I need to be clear about what we're planning. Protocol Harbinger violates at least a dozen Galactic Council treaties on warfare. If we do this, there will be consequences." Rebecca looked at each of her officers in turn. The Council abandoned those colonists. They decided politics and treaties were more important than lives. "I'm making a different choice. Are you all with me?" Every captain responded with immediate affirmation, not because they were blindly following orders, but because they understood something fundamental about being human. When someone calls for help, you answer. When your friends are in danger, you fight. And when monsters come hunting, you show them what real monsters look like. The fleet began preparing for departure immediately. Weapons were armed. Stealth systems were activated. Combat protocols were loaded into every ship's computer. In 72 hours, the Marauders would still be feeding on Outpost Kepler 7, but they wouldn't be alone anymore. Humanity was coming, and the galaxy was about to learn what happened when Earth's most lethal fleet answered a distress call. The jump from faster-than-light travel always felt like being pulled through a keyhole. One moment you're somewhere else entirely, and the next you're back in normal space. The Third Fleet materialized at the very edge of Sector 447, but something was different this time. There were no identification broadcasts, no standard military hails, no announcements of their presence. The 15 human ships simply appeared in the darkness like ghosts, their systems running in complete silence. Every other military force in the galaxy followed the same basic rules when entering a combat zone. You announced who you were. You stated your intentions. You gave the enemy a chance to respond. It was considered civilized. It was what separated advanced species from mindless animals. The Galactic Council had entire departments dedicated to proper warfare etiquette. The humans had read all those rules very carefully. Then they had deleted them from their combat computers. The Marauders had been operating in this region for months now. They had destroyed 3 separate rescue attempts, each one bigger than the last. Each time, their prey had followed the same predictable pattern: jump in with loud engines and bright lights, announce themselves like they were arriving at a dinner party, form up in neat little formations. The Marauders had learned to love these patterns. It made killing so much easier when your enemy insisted on being polite about it. They had no idea that something very different had just entered their hunting ground. Commander Michael Patterson sat at his tactical station on the Indomitable, surrounded by holographic displays that showed every corner of the sector. His fingers moved across the controls with practiced efficiency, directing the fleet's opening moves like a conductor leading an orchestra. For destroyers broke away from the main group, their engines barely producing enough thrust to register on sensors. They moved like shadows, drifting to the debris fields left behind from previous battles. These destroyers were using technology that humanity had acquired the hard way. 5 years ago, they had captured a Kraxan stealth ship after a brutal boarding action. Human engineers had torn that ship apart piece by piece, learning its secrets. Now, every destroyer in the fleet carried prototype stealth systems that bent sensor waves around them like water flowing around a rock. To the Marauders' instruments, these ships simply didn't exist. Lieutenant Commander Billy Jackson commanded the destroyer TSS Phantom. He had grown up in the asteroid belt colonies, places where people learned early that space was trying to kill you every single day. His ship glided through a planetary ring system, ice particles bouncing silently off the hull. His crew worked in complete silence, every system dialed down to minimal power. They were invisible, untouchable, and getting closer to the enemy with every passing minute. "Contact," his sensor operator whispered. "Marauder vessel, designation Alpha 7, distance 3,000 kilometers. She's not moving, looks like she's in feeding position." Billy nodded slowly. "Mark her position and move on. We're not here to fight yet. We're here to watch." This was humanity's advantage. The other species would have attacked immediately, eager to draw first blood. Humans had learned patience from thousands of years of hunting on Earth. A wolf pack doesn't charge at a herd of buffalo. They watch. They learn. They find the weak points. Only then do they strike. For 3 hours, the 4 destroyers mapped everything. Every marauder ship, every energy signature, every communication frequency, every patrol route. The Marauders had sensors, of course. Good ones, actually. But those sensors were designed to detect enemies who wanted to be detected. They swept the darkness looking for engine signatures and weapon systems. They never found the human ships drifting through the void like dead rocks. Commander Patterson watched the tactical picture fill in with terrifying detail. The Marauders had positioned themselves around Outpost Kepler, 7 like a swarm of insects around a corpse. Their ships were obscene things, each one unique and horrible. Humanity had encountered marauder vessels before, but seeing this many in one place was disturbing. Kilometers of scavenged metal grafted onto organic tissue that pulsed with its own grotesque life. They looked like someone had taken a nightmare and given it engines. "Admiral," Michael said quietly, "we have a complete tactical assessment. 237 marauder vessels confirmed. They're arranged in 3 groups, probably tribal divisions based on our previous intelligence. The Veltari colonists are still alive. Sensors are picking up life signs in processing facilities on the outpost." Admiral Rebecca Hayes studied the holographic display with the intensity of someone reading a death warrant. The word processing made her stomach turn. The Marauders didn't kill quickly. They took their time, extracting everything useful from their victims before discarding the rest. Thousands of Veltari colonists were in those facilities right now, experiencing horrors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, if they lived long enough to have nightmares. "How long before they finish?" Rebecca asked. "At their current rate, maybe 36 hours before the colony is completely stripped." Rebecca nodded. 36 hours. That was their window. The Marauders thought they were safe. Their sensors showed an empty system. Their previous victories had made them confident. They had established a comfortable routine, feeding at their leisure while the galaxy cowered behind quarantine zones. They had made themselves predictable, and predictable enemies were dead enemies. The human fleet continued its silent approach. The cruisers and dreadnoughts held position at the system's edge, their powerful weapon systems cold and dark. The support vessels drifted nearby, looking exactly like the harmless supply ships everyone assumed they were. The whole fleet could have been a merchant convoy on a routine supply run. Nothing threatening. Nothing worth noticing. The Marauder sensors swept past them dozens of times. Found nothing. Moved on. Rebecca pulled up her command console and typed out a message. It would be transmitted to every captain simultaneously, encrypted so heavily that even if the Marauders intercepted it, they'd need 1,000 years to crack the code. The message was only 3 words long. "Weapons free. No survivors." She paused before sending it, her finger hovering over the transmit button. The Galactic Council will be furious. There were treaties about giving enemies a chance to surrender, rules about proportional response, guidelines about treating even hostile forces with basic dignity. The Council believed those rules made them civilized, but the Council wasn't here. They weren't watching Veltari families being torn apart in processing facilities. They weren't the ones who had answered the distress call while everyone else ran away. And they certainly weren't the ones who would have to live with the consequences of showing mercy to creatures who had abandoned any claim to it. Rebecca thought about something her grandfather had told her when she was young. He had been a soldier, too, back during the colony wars. Sometimes, he had said, the right thing to do isn't a nice thing to do. Sometimes you have to become something terrible to protect the people who can't protect themselves. That's the burden we carry. She pressed the transmit button. Across the fleet, 15 captains received the message simultaneously. There were no questions, no requests for clarification. They had all known what this mission would be from the moment they left Earth. The Marauders had been terrorizing the galaxy for years, growing bolder with each easy victory. Someone needed to show them that humanity played by different rules. The trap was set. The human fleet coiled around the Marauders like a noose made of steel and fire, invisible and patient. The destroyers had mapped every target. The cruisers had calculated firing solutions. The dreadnoughts had armed weapons that could crack moons in half. Everything was ready. Admiral Hayes looked at the chrono on her display. In 6 hours, this sector would be bathed in artificial dawn as the fleet's weapons lit up the darkness. The Marauders would finally learn what real predators looked like. And somewhere in the processing facilities on Outpost Kepler 7, the Veltari colonists would discover that sometimes help comes not with trumpets and banners, but with silent death delivered to their enemies. The killing would begin at dawn. The first shot fired in the battle made no sound. Space doesn't carry noise, after all. But if it could, that shot would have screamed. The human railgun slug left the TSS Phantom traveling at 40% the speed of light. At that velocity, it wasn't really a weapon anymore. It was physics turned into violence. The chunk of dense metal punched through a Marauder vessel's hull like it wasn't even there. The ship didn't explode dramatically like in old movies. It simply came apart, the kinetic energy ripping through its structure faster than the molecules could react. One moment there was a ship. The next moment there was an expanding cloud of debris and flash-frozen organic matter. The Marauders didn't even know they were under attack yet. 3 more railgun rounds followed in the next 2 seconds. 3 more Marauder ships disintegrated. The 4 human destroyers had positioned themselves perfectly during their 3-hour reconnaissance. Each destroyer had marked 3 targets. Each target had been chosen with cold precision. Command ships, communication relays, sensor platforms. The Marauders were about to be made blind, deaf, and leaderless all at once. Lieutenant Commander Billy Jackson watched his first 3 targets vanish from the tactical display. "Reload and acquire new targets," he said calmly. His crew moved like a machine, each person knowing their role perfectly. "Fire when ready." Across the sector, the pattern repeated. 12 targets eliminated in the first salvo. Then 12 more. Then another 12. The destroyers weren't trying to win the battle alone. They were removing the Marauders' ability to coordinate a defense. By the time the Marauder swarm realized something was wrong, 47 of their ships had been destroyed, and they still couldn't figure out where the attacks were coming from. Captain Jennifer Morgan stood on the bridge of the TSS Retribution, watching her crew work with professional intensity. Her ship was a Prometheus-class cruiser, designed specifically for electronic warfare. While the destroyers were killing ships, Jennifer's job was to kill the Marauders' ability to think. "Commence Operation Babel," she ordered. Her communications officer, a young specialist named Tommychin, grinned as he unleashed hell. The Retribution's communications array was powerful enough to broadcast to half a solar system. Tommy had spent the last 3 hours listening to Marauder communications, learning their frequencies, their encryption, their neural network protocols. The Marauders weren't like humans. They shared thoughts directly between ships, creating a collective consciousness that made them devastating in combat. That shared consciousness was about to become their worst enemy. Tommy's fingers danced across his console, and the Retribution began broadcasting on every Marauder frequency simultaneously. But it wasn't random noise. Human cyber warfare specialists had spent years studying capture Marauder technology, learning how their neural networks functioned. They had developed something special, Digital poison designed specifically for collective minds. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Marauder ship captains suddenly received 1,000 contradictory orders at once. Attack, retreat, regroup, scatter. Their shared neural network, which should have made them stronger, turned into a cascade of confusion. Ships started moving in random directions. Some opened fire on their own allies. Others simply froze, their crews overwhelmed by information overload. "They're fragmenting," Tommy reported, his voice filled with satisfaction. "Their command structure is completely disrupted." Jennifer nodded. "Keep the pressure on. Don't let them recover." The Marauders finally understood they were in a fight. Their response was exactly what humanity had predicted. They had numbers. They had always had numbers. When confused or threatened, they defaulted to the same tactic that had worked them 1,000 times before. Overwhelming force. Swarm tactics. Bury the enemy under sheer weight of numbers. 237 Marauder vessels, minus the 47 already destroyed, surged toward where they thought the human fleet was positioned. It was a tidal wave of biomechanical horror. Ships covered in pulsing organic tissue and scavenged weapons. They expected their enemy to do what every other species did when faced with a marauder swarm. Run. Retreat. Try to escape. The human dreadnoughts accelerated directly toward them. Admiral Rebecca Hayes stood on the bridge of the TSS Indomitable, watching the marauder swarm approach on the tactical display. Her executive officer, Commander Nathan Price, looked nervous. "Admiral, they outnumber us 10-1. Standard doctrine would be to maintain distance and use our range advantage." Rebecca smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. "Nathan, when have we ever followed standard doctrine?" She opened a fleet-wide channel. "All ships," this is Hayes, "break their formation, then break their will. Show them what happens when they pick a fight with Earth." The TSS Indomitable and her sister ship, the TSS Vengeance, were the largest vessels humanity had ever built for war. Each one carried enough firepower to flatten the continent. Their point defense systems were designed to shoot down incoming missiles and fighters. Right now, those systems lit up like angry stars. The Marauders came in screaming, firing everything they had. Plasma bolts, kinetic weapons, even some kind of acid-spewing biological weapon that humanity had never seen before. It should have been overwhelming. It should have shredded the human ships in seconds. Instead, the space between the fleets turned into a wall of light and death. The Indomitable's point defense grid fired 3,000 rounds per second. Every single round was guided by quantum-linked targeting computers running predictive algorithms that could calculate trajectories faster than human minds could comprehend. The incoming Marauder weapons weren't destroyed. They were intercepted with such precision that they detonated hundreds of kilometers away from their targets. But the dreadnoughts weren't just defending. They were attacking. Main batteries opened fire, and the Marauder swarm started dying in earnest. The 6 human cruisers split into pairs, moving through the chaos with lethal grace. Captain Vincent Torres commanded the TSS Hammerblow, paired with the TSS Striker. They dove under the main Marauder formation, their weapons tracking targets with mechanical efficiency. 3 Marauder ships tried to intercept them. All 3 were destroyed before they could fire a shot. "Target-rich environment," Vincent muttered, watching his tactical display light up with enemy contacts. "Weapons. Pick your targets and fire at will." His weapons officer, a veteran named Patricia Walsh, had been waiting for those words. "With pleasure, sir." The thing about human pilots was that they had been training for space combat since before they even left Earth. Centuries of atmospheric fighter combat. Decades of orbital warfare. Virtual reality simulations that let pilots fly 1,000 missions before ever sitting in a real cockpit. And now, neural interfaces that connected their minds directly to their ship systems. The Marauders had numbers and ferocity. Humans had 3,000 years of practice at killing each other efficiently, and they had brought every lesson learned to this fight. Lieutenant Hannah Brooks piloted the destroyer TSS Wraith through an impossible corkscrew maneuver, her neural interface translating her thoughts into ship movements faster than any manual control could manage. 3 Marauder fighters were on her tail, firing wildly. She spun her ship on its axis, kept moving in the same direction but now flying backward, and fired all weapons directly into her pursuers. They vanished in a series of brief flashes. "That's 15 kills," her weapons officer reported. "Not keeping score," Hannah lied. She was absolutely keeping score. Admiral Hayes watched the battle unfold with a detached focus of someone playing three-dimensional chess. The Marauders were brave. She'd give them that. They kept coming even as their ships died around them. But bravery without strategy was just suicide with extra steps. All cruisers exploit gaps in their formation. Destroyers continue targeting their command vessels. Dreadnoughts maintain pressure on their main force. Her orders were followed instantly. The human fleet moved like a living thing, each ship knowing exactly where the others were, what they were doing, what they would do next. The Marauders fought like individuals pretending to be a collective. Humans fought like a collective that had spent centuries learning to kill as one. The battle raged for 18 minutes. In that time, the Marauders lost 93 more ships. The human fleet lost nothing. A few damaged shields, some scorched hull plating, but not a single ship destroyed, not a single life lost. The Marauders were learning a terrible lesson. They had grown used to fighting civilized species who followed rules. Humanity had written those rules, read them carefully, and decided they were for other people. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution. And the Marauders were finally beginning to understand that they weren't the apex predators they thought they were. The sensor alarm on the Indomitable's bridge changed pitch, becoming more urgent. Commander Michael Patterson looked up from his tactical display, his expression shifting from focus to genuinely concerned. That was unusual for him. Michael had been in combat situations for 15 years, and nothing rattled him anymore. "Admiral," he said quietly, "we have a new contact emerging from behind Kepler-7's gas giant. Mass readings are significant." Rebecca Hayes moved to stand beside him, studying the sensor data. The numbers didn't make sense at first. Then they did, and she understood Michael's concern. "How big?" "Approximately the size of a small moon, ma'am. It's been hiding in the planet's sensor shadow this whole time." The Marauder command vessel emerged from behind the massive gas giant like a monster from the deep. Calling it a ship was almost insulting to the concept of ships. It was a floating nightmare. Kilometers upon kilometers of twisted metal fused with organic tissue that pulsed with its own horrible life. Sections of it looked like they had been grown rather than built. Other parts were clearly scavenged from 1,000 different civilizations, welded together into something that shouldn't exist, but did anyway. This was the Marauders' ace in the hole, their final argument. The thing they brought out when they needed to end resistance quickly and brutally. Lieutenant Danny Foster, the Indomitable's weapons officer, whistled low. "That thing has graviton cannons. I'm reading weapon signatures that could shred a planetary defense grid." Rebecca watched the massive vessel position itself, its grotesque bulk blocking out the stars. The Marauders had kept this monster in reserve deliberately. Let the smaller ships engage first. Let the enemy commit their forces. Then bring out the Leviathan and crush whatever was left. It was actually a smart strategy. The Marauders weren't stupid. Whatever else they were, "It's launching fighters," Michael reported. His display showed what looked like a cloud of angry insects pouring out of the command vessel's launch bays. "Mass launch detected. Estimate 4,000 fighters, possibly more." By every military doctrine ever written, this should have been the moment when the human fleet retreated. They had inflicted heavy casualties. They had proven their point. Now was the time to withdraw before facing a weapon platform that outweighed their entire fleet combined. The smart move, the sensible move, the move that kept you alive to fight another day. Rebecca smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was a smile of someone who had just been handed exactly what they wanted. "Deploy the Valkyries," she ordered. Danny looked up from his console. "All of them, ma'am?" "Every single one. Show these things what real numbers look like." The TSS Indomitable and TSS Vengeance had launch bays running the length of their hulls. Those bays had been closed and dark throughout the battle so far. Now they opened like the eyes of sleeping giants. What emerged wasn't human pilots and fancy fighters. What emerged was humanity's answer to the eternal problem of being outnumbered. The Valkyries poured out in clouds of their own. 10,000 autonomous combat drones, each one about the size of a small car. They weren't impressive individually. No heavy armor. No massive weapons. Each one cost about as much as a decent ground car back on Earth. They were cheap, expendable, and absolutely deadly when working together. The key was a distributed intelligence network. Each Valkyrie drone had a basic AI. Nothing fancy. But when 10,000 basic AIs linked together, sharing information and learning in real time, they became something else entirely. A single mind controlling 10,000 bodies, thinking and adapting faster than any biological brain could manage. The Marauder fighters charged forward, expecting the same kind of dogfight they had won 1,000 times before. Individual pilots trying to outfly each other. Skill versus skill. Numbers, overwhelming quality. They got something very different. The Valkyries moved like a school of fish, like a flock of birds, like something alive and aware. When a Marauder fighter fired at one drone, 3 others would already be positioning for the kill shot. When the Marauders tried to concentrate fire, the Valkyries would scatter and reform in new patterns. The drones learned from every attack, adapted to every tactic, shared every lesson across the entire network instantly. Captain Vincent Torres watched the fighter battle from his cruiser and shook his head in amazement. "It's beautiful," he muttered. "Terrifying, but beautiful." His tactical officer agreed. The Marauders are losing 3 fighters for every Valkyrie they destroy. The math doesn't work in their favor. But the real attack wasn't coming from the drones. While everyone's attention was focused on a massive fighter battle, 3 other ships had been moving into position with patient determination. The human support vessels had spent the entire battle drifting slowly, carefully, precisely into a specific formation. They looked harmless. Every military force in the galaxy assumed support vessels were just that: supply ships, repair vessels, mobile bases for the real warships. Humanity had decided that was a useful assumption to encourage. Commander Lisa Martinez commanded the support vessel TSS Anvil. Her ship and her 2 sister ships, the TSS Hammer and TSS Forge, were officially listed as logistics platforms. That was technically true. They did carry supplies. They also carried something else. Something humanity had spent a decade developing in secret. Firing solutions locked, her weapons officer reported. All 3 vessels synchronized and ready. Lisa opened a channel to Admiral Hayes. "Ma'am, the Anvil is in position. We have a clean shot." Rebecca's response was immediate. "Fire when ready, Commander. Let's see if this oversized nightmare bleeds." The 3 support vessels fired simultaneously. What emerged from their hulls weren't normal missiles or energy weapons. They were kinetic kill vehicles, tungsten-jacketed penetrators designed to punch through anything. Each one was accelerated by a magnetic rail system until it was moving at a significant fraction of light speed. At that velocity, mass became destruction. Physics became weaponry. The Marauder command vessels' shields were impressive. They could deflect energy weapons that would vaporize a city. They could absorb plasma bursts that would melt through hull plating like butter. But shields were designed to stop energy. These weren't energy weapons. These were chunks of ultra-dense metal moving at speeds that turned them into relativistic kill vehicles. The tungsten penetrators hit the command vessel's equator in a perfectly timed sequence. The first one punched through the shields like they weren't there. The second one hit microseconds later, widening the breach. The third one went straight through the hull and out the other side. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. The massive vessel continued moving, continued fighting. Then it started coming apart. The damage cascaded. Structural supports failed. Internal explosions rippled through sections that weren't meant to be exposed to vacuum. The organic portions of the ship began dying, withering, the biomechanical fusion that made the vessel possible collapsing all at once. The Marauder command vessel broke in half. The death of something that size wasn't quick or clean. It screamed, not with sound. Space doesn't carry sound, but with electromagnetic radiation across every frequency. Every communication channel in the sector lit up with what could only be described as a scream of agony and rage. The massive vessels, too, have spun away from each other, trailing debris and atmosphere, and the frozen bodies of crew who never had a chance to reach escape pods. Then the reactor went critical, and both have simply ceased to exist in a flash of light that briefly outshone the local star. The effect on the remaining Marauder forces was immediate and total. Their command structure didn't just fail. It evaporated. Ships that had been coordinating their attacks suddenly found themselves alone, leaderless, with no orders and no plan. Some tried to flee. Others, driven by rage or desperation, attempted suicide runs at the human fleet. None of them succeeded. The human ships hunted down the fleeing vessels with methodical precision. No anger, no revenge, just cold, professional execution. The Marauders who chose to fight were eliminated with the same efficiency. The battle that had started with surprise and chaos ended with systematic extermination. When it was over, not a single Marauder vessel remained operational in Sector 447. The human fleet hung in space, weapons still hot, shields still active, ready for any threat that might appear. But there were no more threats. The monsters were dead. The nightmare was over, and the galaxy had just learned that humanity didn't just respond to distress calls. They responded with overwhelming, brutal, absolute force that left no room for doubt about the outcome. The rescue operations began before the last enemy ship had even finished burning. Human medical teams were already loading into transport shuttles while debris still floated through the sector. They didn't wait for everything to be perfectly safe. They didn't wait for official clearance. They just went because people needed help, and waiting meant more people would die. Dr. Raymond Chen led the first medical team to the shattered docking bay of Outpost Kepler 7. The colony had been beautiful once. Now it looked like something out of a horror movie. The Marauders had torn through everything, stripping away anything valuable and leaving destruction in their wake. The processing facilities where they had kept the colonists were the worst. Raymond had seen combat injuries before, but this was different. This was systematic cruelty on an industrial scale. "We need more medical supplies here," he called into his comm, "and get the counselors down here immediately. These people are going to need a lot more than bandages." The Veltari survivors emerged slowly from the processing centers, many of them barely able to walk. They looked at the human medics with confusion at first, then with desperate hope. Some of them had been in those facilities for days, watching their friends and family disappear one by one. They had given up on rescue. They had accepted that they were going to die in those horrible places. Now there were humans everywhere, moving with efficient purpose, treating wounds, handing out food and water, speaking in calm voices through translator units. The Veltari couldn't quite believe it was real. Ambassador Theron had been one of the lucky ones. He had only been captured on the last day of the assault. The Marauders hadn't gotten around to processing him yet. Now he stood on the observation deck of the TSS Indomitable, watching human crews work alongside Veltari volunteers to restore basic life support to the damaged sections of the colony. His translator unit worked overtime trying to convert his species' complex emotional expressions into something humans could understand. Admiral Rebecca Hayes stood beside him, still wearing her combat uniform. She had been awake for 36 hours straight, but she didn't show it. Commanders didn't get to show exhaustion when their people were still working. "You came," Theron said finally, his 4 eyes studying her face, "when no one else would. When the entire Galactic Council said we were a lost cause, you came anyway." Rebecca nodded slowly. "Your ambassador asked for help. We don't ignore distress calls. But your methods..." Theron's translator struggled with his emotional state. "The Council will be very disturbed by your tactics. You showed no mercy. You offered no chance for surrender. You violated at least 12 different treaties about proper warfare conduct." He paused, trying to find the right words. "How do you reconcile such violence with your species' values? You claim to believe in justice and protection, but what you did out there, that was slaughter." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. Down below, she could see her medical teams working beside Veltari survivors, treating wounds both visible and invisible. Human engineers were working on the colony's power systems. Human supply officers were distributing food and medicine. Her people were good at destruction, yes, but they were also good at this. at helping, at building, at healing. Ambassador, she said finally, humanity learned something a long time ago, back when we were still fighting each other on Earth, before we ever reached the stars. We learned that true mercy isn't shown to predators at the expense of their prey. She turned to look at him directly. The marauders would have killed every single person on this station. You know that. I know that. They've done it to hundreds of colonies across this sector. They don't negotiate. They don't take prisoners. They harvest and they move on. Her voice was calm, factual. The Galactic Council's engagement protocols are written by species who haven't faced real extinction in 1,000 years. They've forgotten what it's like to fight for survival. Theron's translator hummed as it processes response. So you simply ignore the rules? You become the very monsters you claim to fight. No, Rebecca said firmly. We didn't come here to wage clean warfare. We came here to ensure you and your people would live. That meant becoming something terrible to those who wanted to destroy you. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. Do I sleep well at night after giving those orders? No, I don't. Will I give them again if necessary? Absolutely. Because the alternative is diplomatic negotiations while your people die screaming in processing facilities. That would haunt me far more than destroying creatures who chose to become monsters. The ambassador was silent, processing this. His species valued philosophy and debate. The Galactic Council operated on principles of measured response and proportional force. What the humans had done violated every assumption about civilized warfare. But his people were alive. That was a simple, undeniable truth. They were alive because the humans had shown up and unleashed hell on their enemies without hesitation or mercy. The Council will not approve, he said quietly. Rebecca smiled, and it was tired but genuine. The Council already doesn't approve. They're sending formal complaints as we speak. She pulled up a data pad showing the incoming diplomatic messages. 3 species have filed official protests about our excessive use of force. 2 more are demanding we face war crimes tribunals. And yet, Theron prompted, sensing there was more. And yet 5 other species have quietly contacted our diplomatic corps asking for defense pacts. 7 frontier colonies have requested permanent human military presence. The Outer Rim worlds are celebrating in the streets. She handed him the data pad so he could see for himself. The politicians hate us. The people who actually live on the frontier love us. I can live with that. The data pad showed news feeds from across the galaxy. The core worlds were having heated debates about human military doctrine and whether it represented a threat to galactic stability. But in the frontier regions, in the colonies that lived in constant fear of raiders and pirates and marauder attacks, the reaction was very different. Street parties, celebrations, relief that someone was finally fighting back against the predators who had terrorized them for years. 3 days later, the evacuation was complete. Every Veltari survivor who wanted to leave had been transported to safe worlds. Those who wanted to stay and rebuild their colony had been given supplies and equipment. Human engineers had restored basic life support systems. Human security forces had set up defensive platforms to prevent any return attacks. Admiral Hayes stood on the bridge of the Indomitable as the fleet prepared to depart. Commander Michael Patterson approached with his datapad, looking more serious than usual. Final casualty report, ma'am. We lost 47 Valkyrie drones. The TSS Striker took some hull damage, but nothing structural. No human casualties. No ships lost. Rebecca nodded. By any military standard, it was a perfect victory. They had saved thousands of lives while losing nothing but some expendable drones and some hull plating that could be repaired. There's something else, Michael continued. Galactic Council Intelligence has flagged 17 new distress calls from various sectors, all reporting marauder incursions. He paused, all of them specifically requesting human assistance. Not Council forces, not their own planetary defense. They're asking for us by name. Rebecca took the datapad and read through the requests. 17 colonies, spread across 4 sectors, all of them facing the same nightmare that Outpost Kepler 7 had faced, all of them abandoned by the Council as acceptable losses, all of them hoping that humanity would answer their calls the way they had answered Theron's. She made her decision without hesitation. Patterson, plot courses to each distress beacon. Start with the oldest calls first. Contact Fleet Command and tell them we need reinforcements. At least 3 more battle groups. Yes, ma'am. They'll want to know our operational parameters. Rebecca looked out at the stars, her reflection ghost-like in the viewport. Tell them to prepare Implementation Protocol Harbinger for fleet-wide deployment. If the galaxy wants Earth's protection, they're going to learn what that actually means. She turned back to her command crew. They were tired. They had just fought a brutal battle. But they were ready. She could see it in their faces. They understood what was happening. Humanity was making a choice about what kind of species they wanted to be in this galaxy. We're not heroes, she said quietly, more to herself than to them. We're not saviors riding on white horses. We're the thing that nightmares fear. We're the predators who hunt other predators. And we're just getting started. The Indomitable's engines powered up, the ship thrumming with contained energy. The fleet formed up around the flagship, 15 ships that had just rewritten the rules of galactic warfare. They jumped to FTL together, disappearing in flashes of twisted space-time. Behind them, Outpost Kepler. 7 began the slow process of healing. The Veltari survivors would rebuild. They would remember. And they would tell their children about the day humanity answered their call for help. Across the galaxy, 17 colonies watched their sensors, hoping to see human ships emerge from FDL, hoping that the stories were true, that when you called for help and everyone else abandoned you, humanity would answer. The message had been sent, written in the destruction of a marauder fleet. Predators who feast on the innocent will find that Earth has sent its own apex predators to hunt them. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a threat. It was simply a statement of fact. The most lethal human fleet had responded to the distress call, and the galaxy would never be the same again.